You feel tired after walking for a while, and it feels like a simple, obvious limit of the body. But for most of human history, walking for hours each day was not unusual. It was necessary for finding food, water, and safety, and the human body was shaped inside that constant movement, not outside of it, which suggests that fatigue may not be a fixed boundary, but something that has slowly changed as human life became more still, more sheltered, and less dependent on movement. So instead of asking why people in the past could endure more, it may be more accurate to ask what has been reduced or altered in the body we have now, and why Ice Age humans never got tired walking. For most of human history, walking was not something people chose to do for health or endurance. It was simply the way life moved forward, and this difference changes how the body responds to it in ways that are easy to overlook today, because when walking becomes optional, it also becomes noticeable, and once it is noticeable, it begins to feel like effort. But in the environments where early humans lived, especially during the long cold periods of the Ice Age, movement was not separated from daily survival. It was part of every task, every search, every return. And because of that, the body did not treat walking as an extra demand placed on it, but as the background state it was always in, which means the question of why they did not feel tired in the same way may begin not with strength, but with expectation. Because fatigue is not only a physical signal, it is also shaped by what the body is used to doing over long stretches of time. And for early humans, long stretches of time were almost always spent in motion across uneven ground, through cold air, over distances that were not measured in steps but in necessity. And when something is repeated not occasionally but continuously, the body reorganizes around it, adjusting muscles, tendons, and even patterns of energy use, so that the repeated action no longer feels like a strain in the same way, which is why the idea of walking until tired would not have carried the same meaning, because stopping was not guided by a preset limit of comfort, but by changes in the environment, by finding food, by reaching a place that offered some protection from wind or cold, and this shifts the role of fatigue from being a signal to stop into something quieter, something that exists but does not dominate the experience of movement. And this can be seen in how modern bodies react differently when placed into repeated motion again. Because over time, the same action that once felt tiring begins to settle into a rhythm that feels more stable, not because the body has become stronger in a dramatic way, but because it has begun to return, in a limited sense, to a pattern it was shaped for over thousands of generations. And when we consider Ice Age humans, it is important to avoid imagining them as tireless or fundamentally different, because their biology was not separate from ours, but their daily structure was, and that structure removed the clear boundary between activity and rest that defines modern life. So walking did not stand out as something to endure. It blended into the continuous flow of being alive in a landscape that required movement as its most basic condition, and in that condition, fatigue did not disappear, but it changed its place in the body's priorities, becoming less of a stopping point and more of a background sensation that could be carried without interrupting the larger need to keep moving, which suggests that what we feel today as early or overwhelming tiredness may not come from a lack of capacity, but from a body that has been separated from the continuous, low-intensity movement it once depended on. And when that separation becomes normal, even simple actions begin to feel heavier than they once were, not because the action itself has changed, but because the context around it has shifted in a way the body has not fully adapted to. If walking was the background of life rather than a separate activity, then the body did not need to prepare for it or recover from it in the way we often do now, because preparation and recovery only become necessary when something stands apart from the normal flow of the day. And in the Ice Age, there was very little that stood apart from movement itself, since the search for food, the tracking of animals, the shifting of camps, and even the simple act of staying within a safer landscape all required steady ongoing travel. And this continuity meant that the body was rarely pushed suddenly into motion from stillness, which is one of the main reasons modern walking can feel tiring, because today movement often begins after long periods of sitting, when muscles are inactive, circulation is reduced, and the nervous system is not tuned to sustained effort. So the first stages of movement feel heavier than they need to, not because the distance is extreme, but because the transition itself is abrupt, whereas in earlier human environments, that transition was almost invisible, as movement flowed gently from one task into the next without a clear boundary, allowing the body to remain in a low but constant state of activity that did not demand sudden bursts of energy. And over time, this kind of steady use shapes how fatigue is experienced, because the body becomes efficient at distributing effort across long durations, relying more on slower, sustainable energy systems rather than short, intense ones. And this reduces the sharp signals that are often interpreted as tiredness, replacing them with a more even, less intrusive sense of exertion that can continue for extended periods without forcing a stop. And this pattern is supported by what is understood about human physiology, where repeated low-intensity movement improves coordination between muscles and reduces unnecessary tension, meaning that less energy is wasted with each step, and as efficiency increases, the same action feels easier even if the external conditions remain the same, which helps explain why modern individuals who gradually increase their daily walking often report that distances, which once felt difficult, become manageable without a dramatic increase in strength, because the change is not only in the muscles but in how the entire system organizes movement. And when we place this understanding back into the context of Ice Age humans, it becomes clearer that their experience of walking was not defined by pushing through fatigue, but by rarely encountering it in a disruptive way, since their bodies were already aligned with the demands of continuous motion from an early age, growing and adapting within that pattern rather than adjusting to it later in life. And this developmental aspect is important, because a body that learns to move continuously from childhood integrates that movement into its baseline function, making it feel natural rather than effortful. And this stands in contrast to modern patterns where long periods of stillness are common during growth, shaping a different baseline where movement becomes something that must be reintroduced rather than maintained. And this shift, though subtle, has lasting effects on how the body interprets effort, how quickly it signals fatigue, and how easily it settles into prolonged activity, which suggests that the difference between past and present is not simply one of strength or endurance, but of continuity, of whether movement is an occasional demand placed on the body or the quiet condition it exists within. And when that condition is lost, even something as simple as walking can begin to feel like work, in a way that would have been unfamiliar in earlier human life. When movement is constant, the body does not divide the day into periods of effort and rest in the same way it often does now, and this quiet shift changes how fatigue appears and how it is interpreted, because fatigue becomes less like a clear signal that demands attention, and more like a gradual sensation that can exist without interrupting action. And in Ice Age environments, this would have been essential, not because early humans were immune to tiredness, but because their survival depended on continuing through it at a steady pace rather than stopping at the first sign of discomfort. And over many generations, this kind of continuous requirement does not simply strengthen muscles, it shapes how the nervous system prioritizes signals, allowing certain sensations to remain in the background while more urgent environmental cues, such as temperature, terrain, or the presence of animals, take precedence. And this creates a different internal balance, where the feeling of tiredness is not disappear but loses its dominance over behavior. And this can be understood by observing how the body adapts when exposed again to repeated, low-intensity movement over long periods. Because as walking becomes more frequent and more evenly distributed across the day, the sharp contrast between movement and stillness begins to fade, and with it, the intensity of fatigue signals often decreases, not because the body is ignoring them, but because they are no longer amplified by sudden changes in activity. And this reflects a broader principle in human physiology, where consistency reduces friction within the system, allowing energy to flow more evenly without triggering strong corrective responses. And in the context of early humans, consistency was not a choice but a condition imposed by the environment, where distances had to be covered regardless of comfort, and where stopping too early could mean failing to reach a source of food or a place of relative safety before nightfall or worsening weather. And this constant negotiation with the landscape would have reinforced a pattern in which movement was sustained not through bursts of effort, but through a quiet persistence that avoided extremes. And this is important, because extreme effort is often what generates the most noticeable fatigue, while moderate, continuous effort can be maintained for much longer without overwhelming the system And when modern life removes the need for this kind of persistence, replacing it with long periods of stillness and occasional concentrated activity, the body begins to lose its familiarity with sustained movement, and fatigue returns in a more abrupt and noticeable form, making even moderate distances feel significant. And this does not mean that modern humans are less capable in an absolute sense, but that the conditions that once supported a different experience of movement are no longer present. And without those conditions, the same body begins to respond differently, revealing how closely the feeling of tiredness is tied not only to biology, but to the patterns of life that surround it. And when we consider Ice Age humans in this light, the idea that they did not get tired in the same way becomes less about exceptional endurance and more about a body and environment that were aligned, where movement did not stand out as a challenge but remained a quiet, continuous thread running through every part of daily existence. To understand why walking did not exhaust Ice Age humans in the way it often seems to exhaust people now, it helps to look not first at willpower or toughness, but at the body itself, because the human body was not designed in a world of chairs, floors, roads, and protected interiors. It was shaped in a world where balance, footing, distance, cold, and uneven ground were part of ordinary life. And this matters because a body built inside movement does not experience movement as an intrusion. It experiences it as its natural setting. And one of the clearest signs of this lies in the structure of the human body as a walking body, with long legs relative to many other primates, feet shaped for repeated contact with the ground, arches that help manage force and return energy, large joints built to carry weight over distance, and muscles arranged not simply for short bursts, but for ongoing, coordinated motion. And none of this makes humans unique in the animal world as perfect walkers. But it does show that regular movement over land was not a side feature of human life. It was one of its central biological conditions. And by the time humans were living through the cold phases of the Pleistocene, that condition had already been deeply established over a much longer evolutionary history, beginning far earlier in Africa, where the capacity to move efficiently across open landscapes became increasingly important. So when later human groups entered colder and harsher regions, they were not inventing the walking body from nothing. They were carrying with them an older inheritance, one shaped long before the Ice Age itself. And in that sense, the Ice Age did not create human endurance, but it did continue to reward bodies that could keep moving steadily without wasting energy. And this is where the difference between strength and economy becomes important, because a body does not need to be constantly powerful to move far. It needs to avoid losing energy unnecessarily. And much of human anatomy supports exactly that kind of economy, from the way the hips stabilize the torso, to the way the spine helps manage upright posture, to the way tendons and muscles coordinate to keep each step from becoming a separate effort. And when these systems are used often, they work together more smoothly, reducing the sense that each movement must be forced, while when they are used less, the same structures remain, but they are no longer integrated into daily life in the same continuous way, and movement begins to feel less like a default setting and more like a task. And this is one reason it would be misleading to imagine Ice Age humans as superhuman walkers with endless reserves, because the more grounded explanation is quieter than that. Their bodies were simply living in the kind of world those bodies had long been shaped to handle, a world where walking was so common that anatomy, habit, and environment all reinforced one another. And the archaeological record supports this broader picture not by proving exactly how each person felt, which it cannot do, but by showing that humans repeatedly occupied large landscapes, moved across changing climates, followed migrating resources, and adapted to places that demanded regular travel. And none of that suggests a life without fatigue, but it does suggest a life in which sustained movement was normal enough that the body could not afford to treat it as a crisis. And once we see that, the question becomes less mysterious, because the body of an Ice Age human was not resisting walking as a modern inconvenience. It was meeting the ground with a structure that had been shaped across deep time for exactly that kind of steady use. And when walking is supported by anatomy, repeated by habit, and demanded by the environment all at once, tiredness does not necessarily vanish, but it has much less room to become the central experience of moving through the world. If the human body was shaped inside long periods of steady movement, then its internal systems were also organized to support that kind of activity without creating constant interruption. And one of the most important of these systems is how the body manages energy over time. Because walking for long distances does not rely on sudden bursts of strength, but on the ability to sustain low levels of effort without exhausting available fuel too quickly. And in this context, the body tends to favor slower, more stable energy pathways that can operate for extended periods, drawing on stored resources in a gradual way rather than consuming them rapidly. And this matters because the sensation of fatigue is closely tied to how quickly energy is used and how efficiently it is replenished. So when energy use is balanced and predictable, fatigue signals tend to rise more slowly and remain less disruptive, allowing movement to continue without sharp declines in comfort or function. And in Ice Age conditions, where food was not always immediately available and movement could not be easily paused, this kind of stability would have been far more useful than the ability to produce short, intense efforts. And over generations, bodies that managed energy in a steady, economical way would have been better suited to these environments, not because they avoided fatigue entirely, but because they delayed its most limiting forms. And this principle can still be observed today when people engage in prolonged, low-intensity activities such as walking for many hours, where the initial sense of effort often gives way to a more even rhythm, and the body settles into a pattern that can be maintained without constant strain. And this shift does not require exceptional fitness, but rather a gradual alignment between effort and energy use, where the body is neither overexerted nor underused. And this balance reduces the need for strong corrective signals, which are often experienced as sudden tiredness or discomfort. And in contrast, modern patterns of movement frequently disrupt this balance, because long periods of inactivity are followed by relatively short periods of movement, which encourages the body to rely more on quicker, less sustainable energy pathways at the beginning of activity, leading to a faster buildup of fatigue signals even during tasks that are not physically extreme. And this can create the impression that walking itself is demanding, when in fact the demand is coming from the mismatch between the body's current state and the pattern of movement being asked of it. And when we return to the context of Ice Age humans, this mismatch would have been much less common, because their daily lives provided a continuous, moderate level of activity that kept energy systems engaged in a stable way, reducing the contrast between rest and movement, and allowing the body to operate within a narrower, more manageable range of effort. And this does not mean that their lives were easy, or that they did not experience exhaustion, especially under harsh conditions. But it does suggest that the ordinary act of walking was supported by an internal system that was already tuned for endurance, making it less likely to trigger the kind of immediate, noticeable fatigue that often accompanies movement in modern settings, where the body is repeatedly shifting between extremes rather than remaining within a steady flow. A body built for steady walking is not only a matter of bones, muscles, and fuel, but also of rhythm, because the human walking body works best when many small systems coordinate without interruption, and this coordination becomes one of the quiet reasons movement can continue for a long time without turning into obvious strain. Since each step does not begin from zero, but flows from the one before it, allowing balance, posture, breathing, and muscle tension to settle into a repeating pattern that saves energy instead of wasting it. And this is especially important in a world like the Ice Age, where ground was rarely smooth, weather could shift quickly, and travel often meant adjusting constantly to slopes, cold surfaces, loose soil, stones, ice, or shallow snow, because under those conditions, a body that moved awkwardly would lose energy with every correction, while a body accustomed to uneven terrain would absorb those variations more quietly, making the act of walking less dramatic and less tiring even over longer distances. And this is one reason it helps to think of endurance not as a single reserve hidden inside the muscles, but as a relationship between the body and the land. Because the more often the body meets irregular ground, the more it learns to respond with small, efficient adjustments rather than large, wasteful ones. And when that happens, the feet place themselves more carefully, the ankles react more smoothly, the hips stabilize the upper body with less unnecessary sway, and the arms support balance without creating extra tension, all of which lowers the cost of movement in ways that are hard to notice from the outside. And this matters because much of what people experience as tiredness is not only the depletion of energy, but also the accumulation of tiny inefficiencies, small losses repeated thousands of times, until the whole act begins to feel heavier than it should. And in early human environments, repeated exposure to walking across real landscapes would have trained the body away from many of those losses from an early age, making movement more economical without requiring constant conscious effort. And this helps explain why walking for hours would not necessarily have felt extraordinary, because the body was not fighting the ground with every step. It was cooperating with it through habits shaped over years and generations. And this older pattern begins far before the coldest ice age settings, reaching back to earlier human evolution in Africa, where upright walking over distance became one of the defining conditions of human life. So by the time later humans entered colder Eurasian environments, they were not learning to move as if for the first time. They were extending a much older inheritance into harsher climates. And what changed was not the basic structure of walking itself, but the surfaces, temperatures, and daily demands placed around it, all of which continued to reward bodies that could stay steady rather than wasteful. And when we compare this to many modern settings, the contrast becomes clear, because flat floors, smooth roads, long sitting, and protected interiors reduce the need for constant low-level adjustment, so the body gradually loses some of the fine coordination that once made movement feel natural and almost automatic. And when walking is then reintroduced in a more concentrated way, the body often responds with stiffness, imbalance, and earlier fatigue, not because it lacks the basic design for walking, but because the old rhythm has been interrupted, and the systems that once worked together continuously are no longer practiced in the same way. So in the case of Ice Age humans, the reason walking did not overwhelm them was not that they possessed some lost magical strength, but that their bodies, their habits, and their landscapes remained closely matched, and when that match is preserved, walking ceases to feel like a separate burden, and becomes once again what it was for most of human history, the quiet, repeating form of life itself. If the body is able to move for long periods without becoming quickly exhausted, it is not only because of structure or coordination, but also because of how energy is released and used aufmeng. And this is where an important difference begins to appear between the way modern bodies often operate and the way bodies would have functioned in Ice Age conditions. Because energy is not simply a fixed amount that runs out at the same speed in all situations, it is regulated continuously, influenced by intensity, rhythm, temperature, and the availability of food. And when movement stays within a low and steady range, the body can rely more heavily on slower energy processes that are capable of sustaining effort for extended durations without triggering sharp declines. And this kind of energy use is not dramatic or powerful, but it is stable, and stability is what allows movement to continue without interruption. And in Ice Age environments, where walking was not performed in short, isolated sessions but spread across the entire day, this stability would have been the default condition, not something that had to be achieved deliberately. And one way to understand this is to consider how the body responds when movement intensity remains moderate, because under those conditions, energy is drawn gradually from stored sources, and the systems responsible for delivering oxygen and nutrients to muscles operate within a manageable range, avoiding the buildup of signals that are commonly associated with rapid fatigue, such as the accumulation of byproducts from high-intensity effort. And as a result, the feeling of tiredness emerges more slowly and often remains less disruptive, allowing the person to continue moving even while aware of exertion. And this pattern aligns with what is observed in prolonged walking today, where individuals who maintain a steady pace over long distances often experience a kind of even, sustainable effort rather than repeated peaks of exhaustion. And although Ice Age humans faced additional challenges such as cold temperatures and uneven terrain, these factors did not necessarily force constant high-intensity movement, but rather encouraged a controlled, consistent pace that could be maintained across varying conditions. And this is important, because the body is far more capable of enduring long periods of moderate activity than short periods of extreme effort. And when daily life is organized around that moderate range, the systems that support it become more efficient and less likely to trigger strong fatigue responses. And this helps explain why walking, even over significant distances, would not have been experienced as a repeated cycle of depletion and recovery, but as a continuous process where energy use and energy supply remained closely aligned. And when we compare this to modern patterns, the contrast becomes clear because many people now move in bursts, alternating between long inactivity and relatively higher effort when they do move, which disrupts the balance between energy release and demand, often causing the body to rely more on quicker, less sustainable energy pathways at the start of activity, leading to an earlier and more noticeable onset of fatigue even during tasks that are not extreme. And this creates a perception that walking itself is inherently tiring, when in fact the tiring aspect comes from the way the body is being asked to shift between different states, rather than remain within a steady flow. And when we return again to the context of Ice Age humans, it becomes easier to see that their ability to walk for long periods was not based on pushing beyond natural limits, but on rarely exceeding them in the first place, because their pace, their environment, and their internal energy systems were aligned in a way that kept movement within a sustainable range, allowing fatigue to exist without becoming the defining feature of the experience. When energy is used slowly and steadily, the body is not only able to continue moving for longer periods, it also changes how effort is felt from the inside, because the sensation of fatigue is closely linked to how quickly the body is pushed away from its current balance. And when that push is gradual, the body has time to adjust without creating strong signals that demand an immediate stop. And this is important in understanding why walking in Ice Age conditions would not have felt like a repeated struggle against tiredness. Since the pace of life itself rarely forced sudden increases in intensity, and instead favoured a kind of controlled persistence that stayed within a manageable range. And this persistence affects how the brain interprets physical sensations, because fatigue is not only produced by muscles but also by the nervous system, which continuously evaluates effort and decides how strongly to signal discomfort. And when effort remains predictable and within expected limits, the brain tends to keep these signals quieter, allowing movement to continue without interruption. But when effort rises quickly or unpredictably, those signals become sharper, more noticeable, and more difficult to ignore. And this difference can be observed even in modern contexts, where a slow, uninterrupted walk over a long distance often feels easier than a shorter walk that includes frequent stops, changes in pace, or sudden bursts of speed, even if the total distance is the same, because each interruption requires the body to readjust, briefly increasing effort and amplifying fatigue signals. And over time, these small spikes accumulate, making the overall experience feel more tiring than a smooth, continuous movement. And in Ice Age environments, where movement was guided by terrain and necessity rather than artificial schedules or abrupt transitions, this smoothness would have been more common, allowing the body to remain within a narrow band of effort for extended periods. And this consistency supports not only physical endurance but also mental steadiness, because the absence of sharp fatigue signals reduces the need for constant decision-making about whether to continue or stop. And this is a subtle but important point, since much of what people experience as tiring today includes not only physical strain, but also the repeated awareness of that strain, the internal dialogue that arises when the body signals discomfort and the mind responds to it. And when those signals are quieter, that dialogue becomes less intrusive, making movement feel less like something to endure and more like something that simply continues. And this does not mean that Ice Age humans were unaware of effort, but that their experience of it was likely shaped by a more stable relationship between demand and capacity, where the body was rarely pushed far outside its accustomed range, and as a result, fatigue remained present but did not dominate attention in the same way. And when we compare this to modern life, where movement often begins after long stillness and includes irregular changes in pace, the contrast becomes clearer, because the body is repeatedly asked to shift states, and each shift increases the likelihood of noticeable fatigue, even if the total amount of work is not greater. And this suggests that the feeling of being tired while walking today may come less from the distance itself, and more from the instability of how that distance is approached. And in a world where walking was continuous, steady, and necessary, that instability would have been much less common, allowing the body to move through long periods of activity without the repeated disruption that turns effort into a central experience. When effort remains steady and the body is not pushed into sudden changes, something else begins to happen that is easy to miss, because the body starts to reduce how much energy each movement actually costs. And this quiet reduction plays a large role in why long periods of walking can feel manageable rather than exhausting, since fatigue is not only about how much energy is available, but also about how much energy is lost with each step, and in a body that is used to continuous movement, many of those losses are gradually minimized, not through conscious control, but through repetition, because repetition allows the body to refine timing, adjust muscle tension, and coordinate movements so that less effort is wasted on unnecessary actions. And over time, this creates a form of efficiency that does not feel like strength, but functions in a similar way by allowing the same task to be completed with less cost. And in Ice Age environments, where walking was repeated daily across varied terrain, this kind of refinement would have been reinforced constantly, since each step provided feedback that could be integrated into the next. And this ongoing process would have reduced small inefficiencies that, if left uncorrected, would accumulate into noticeable fatigue over long distances. And this is one reason why it can be misleading to think of endurance as something that depends only on physical capacity, because a large part of endurance comes from how little energy is wasted during movement, and when waste is reduced, the body can continue longer without reaching the point where fatigue becomes overwhelming. And this principle is still visible today when individuals become more accustomed to walking or other repetitive activities, because even without a large increase in strength, the activity begins to feel easier as coordination improves and unnecessary tension decreases. And this change often appears gradually, as if the body is learning to move in a smoother, more economical way. And this learning process is not limited to adulthood but begins early in life, meaning that a person who grows up in an environment where movement is constant will develop patterns of motion that are more efficient from the start, while a person who grows up with less movement may need to rebuild those patterns later. And when we consider Ice Age humans, it is likely that this process of refinement was ongoing across generations, supported by a lifestyle that provided constant exposure to the conditions that shaped efficient movement. And this does not require imagining any extraordinary abilities, but simply recognizing that a body repeatedly placed in the same kind of demand will gradually reduce the cost of meeting that demand, and when that cost becomes low enough, the activity itself begins to feel less like effort and more like a neutral state, something that can continue without drawing constant attention. And this helps explain why walking did not stand out as something tiring in the same way, because the combination of steady energy use, consistent rhythm, and reduced waste created a situation where the body could operate within its limits without approaching them too quickly. And in contrast, when modern patterns interrupt this process, limiting repetition and introducing irregular movement, the body loses some of that efficiency, and each step begins to cost slightly more than it once did. And over time, those small differences accumulate, making the same distance feel more demanding than it might have in a different context. And when viewed in this way, the difference between past and present is not a simple loss of strength, but a shift in how efficiently the body is able to use what it already has. And when efficiency declines, fatigue rises earlier, even if the underlying capacity remains largely unchanged, which suggests that the experience of tiredness while walking is shaped as much by how the body moves as by how far it moves. And in the world of Ice Age humans, where movement was continuous, refined, and necessary, that experience would have been quieter, more stable, and less likely to interrupt the ongoing flow of life. If walking becomes efficient, steady, and continuous, then another change begins to appear, one that is less visible in the body and more present in how movement is felt, because effort is not only measured in energy or mechanics, it is also shaped by perception, by how the brain interprets what the body is doing. And when an action is familiar, repeated, and expected, the brain tends to reduce how strongly it signals that action as a burden, allowing it to fade into the background of awareness. And this is important in understanding why walking in Ice Age conditions would not have felt like a constant challenge, since for early humans, movement was not something to question or evaluate. It was simply the ongoing condition of being in the world, and when something becomes that familiar, it no longer demands the same level of attention, and without that attention, the sense of effort becomes quieter, less defined, and less likely to interrupt the flow of activity. And this can still be observed today in simple ways, where a person engaged in a repetitive, low-intensity activity for a long time may gradually stop noticing the effort itself, even though the body continues to work, because the brain shifts its focus elsewhere. And this shift reduces the subjective feeling of fatigue, even if the physical processes remain unchanged. And in Ice Age environments, where attention needed to be directed toward external conditions such as terrain, weather, and the presence of animals, it would have been more useful for the brain to minimize internal distractions, including the constant awareness of mild exertion. And this does not mean that fatigue was ignored or suppressed entirely, but that it was calibrated differently, allowing movement to continue without being continuously interrupted by internal signals that demanded rest. And this calibration is shaped over time, as the brain learns which sensations are important enough to prioritize, and which can remain in the background without immediate consequence. And when movement is constant and necessary, the threshold for signaling fatigue may shift, making the same level of exertion feel less urgent or less disruptive. And this is closely related to how modern experiences of walking can change with habit, because as an activity becomes more routine, it often feels less tiring, not only because the body adapts, but because the brain no longer treats it as something that requires evaluation at every moment. And this reduction in monitoring lowers the mental component of fatigue, which can be as significant as the physical component, especially during long periods of activity. And when we consider Ice Age humans, whose daily lives required sustained attention to the environment rather than to internal states, it becomes more likely that walking existed as a kind of quiet background process, something that supported other actions rather than standing out on its own. And in that state, effort does not disappear, but it becomes less noticeable, less central, and less likely to define the experience of movement. And this helps explain why walking for long periods would not necessarily have been felt as exhausting in the way it often is today, because the perception of effort had been shaped by a life where movement was constant, expected, and rarely questioned. And when perception changes in that way, the same physical action can feel very different, not because the body has become limitless, but because the mind no longer treats each step as something that needs to be measured against a sense of comfort or strain. When the brain begins to treat movement as a background process rather than a task that needs constant evaluation, another shift follows, one that affects how quickly discomfort turns into the feeling of needing to stop, because the point at which the body decides that effort is too much is not fixed. It depends on how signals are interpreted in context, and when movement is expected, continuous, and tied directly to survival, the threshold for interruption can become higher, not through force or resistance, but through gradual adjustment, as the nervous system learns that ongoing effort is normal and does not require immediate response. And this changes the experience of walking in a subtle but important way, because the same physical signals that might lead someone today to pause or rest can remain present without triggering that decision, allowing movement to continue even while mild fatigue is felt. And this does not mean that Ice Age humans ignored exhaustion or pushed beyond safe limits, but that the boundary between manageable effort and stopping point was shaped differently by the conditions of life. And in those conditions, stopping too early could carry consequences, such as failing to reach shelter before temperature dropped further or losing track of a moving resource. So the body and brain would have been calibrated over time to maintain movement within a sustainable range rather than interrupt it frequently. And this calibration can be seen in modern situations where individuals engage in long-duration, low-intensity activity, because after an initial period of adjustment, the urge to stop often becomes less frequent, even if the activity continues, suggesting that the threshold for discomfort has shifted, not because the body has become immune to fatigue, but because the brain has adapted to the pattern of effort and no longer interprets it as a signal requiring immediate change. And this adaptation is closely linked to repetition and expectation, because when an activity is repeated daily and becomes part of the baseline of life, the brain incorporates it into what is considered normal, and signals that once stood out begin to blend into the background, reducing their impact on behavior. And in Ice Age environments, where walking was not an occasional event but a constant condition, this process would have been reinforced continuously, making the act of continuing through mild fatigue less noticeable and less mentally demanding. And this also reduces the accumulation of what can be called anticipatory fatigue, the sense that effort will soon become overwhelming, because when the brain expects an activity to be sustainable, it does not amplify early signals in the same way, and this helps explain why modern experiences of walking can sometimes feel more tiring than they should, not only because of physical factors, but because of how the brain anticipates and reacts to effort, especially when movement is less familiar or less integrated into daily life. And when we consider Ice Age humans in this context, the difference becomes clearer, because their perception of effort was shaped by a life in which movement was continuous, necessary, and expected. And under those conditions, the decision to stop was less likely to be triggered by mild or moderate fatigue, allowing walking to continue as a steady, ongoing process rather than a repeated cycle of effort and interruption. When the threshold for stopping shifts and movement is no longer constantly evaluated as a burden, the experience of walking changes again in a way that is easy to overlook, because effort becomes something that can exist without being labelled. And this matters because the act of labelling a sensation often intensifies it, turning a quiet physical signal into a clear and dominant feeling such as, "I am tired." And once that label appears, it tends to guide behaviour, encouraging rest or avoidance. But when movement is continuous and expected, as it was for Ice Age humans, the need to define each sensation becomes less important, and without that definition, the sensation itself can remain less intrusive, allowing the body to continue without drawing attention to every sign of exertion. And this does not mean that early humans lacked awareness of their bodies, but that their awareness was oriented differently, focused more on external conditions than on internal evaluation, because attention had to be directed toward navigating terrain, reading weather, and responding to the presence of animals or other groups. And in such an environment, the brain benefits from reducing the prominence of internal signals that do not require immediate action, including mild fatigue, and this creates a state in which movement continues alongside sensation without interruption, not because the sensation disappears, but because it is not elevated into something that demands change. And this can still be observed in modern situations where attention is absorbed by the environment or by a steady task, because under those conditions, people often report that they can continue moving longer without feeling as tired, even though the physical work remains the same, suggesting that perception plays a central role in how fatigue is experienced. And when perception is shaped by a life where movement is constant, the relationship between sensation and action changes, reducing the frequency with which the body is asked to stop and rest. And this effect would have been reinforced over generations in Ice Age conditions, where daily survival depended on maintaining a steady connection between movement and environment, rather than breaking that connection repeatedly. And as a result, walking would have been experienced less as a series of individual efforts and more as a continuous state, where steps follow one another without needing to be assessed individually. And in that state, the idea of becoming tired from walking in a way that forces frequent stopping becomes less central, not because the body is limitless, but because the interaction between sensation, attention, and decision has shifted, allowing effort to remain in the background while movement continues in the foreground. And when we compare this to modern life, where attention often turns inward and movement is separated from necessity, the difference becomes clearer, because the act of noticing, labeling, and reacting to fatigue becomes more frequent, making the same level of effort feel more significant than it might have in a different context. And this suggests that part of the answer to why Ice Age humans did not get tired walking in the way we do today lies not only in their bodies or their environment, but in how their perception of effort was shaped by a life in which movement was constant, expected, and rarely questioned. If the body and perception both support continuous movement, then the environment itself becomes the final element that completes the pattern, because the landscapes of the Ice Age did not allow for a life built around stillness. And this matters because the structure of the environment determines how often the body must move, how far it must go, and how it distributes effort across the day. And during colder periods, large parts of the world were open, exposed, and resource-sparse, which meant that food, water, and shelter were not concentrated in one place but spread across wider areas, requiring regular travel to locate and return with what was needed. And this kind of environment does not demand speed as much as it demands persistence, because moving too quickly would waste energy, while moving too slowly would risk not reaching a necessary destination in time. So the most effective pattern becomes a steady, moderate pace that can be maintained over long distances without exhausting the body, and this aligns closely with how the human body functions most efficiently, reinforcing the connection between biology and landscape. And in such conditions, walking is not structured as a separate activity with a clear beginning and end, but as a continuous thread that links different parts of the day together, from searching for food to relocating shelter to following seasonal changes, and this continuity reduces the contrast between effort and rest, making movement feel less like a demand and more like a condition that is always present. And the cold itself also plays a role, not by making movement easier, but by making it necessary, because maintaining body temperature in cold environments requires a constant balance between conserving energy and generating heat, and gentle, ongoing movement can contribute to that balance without the risks associated with sudden, intense exertion. And this creates another reason for sustained walking to become part of daily life, not only for reaching resources but also for maintaining a stable internal state in a challenging climate. And when these environmental pressures are consistent over long periods, they shape behavior in a predictable way, encouraging patterns of movement that are regular, moderate, and continuous rather than irregular and extreme. And over time, these patterns become embedded not only in daily routines but also in how the body expects to function, reinforcing the idea that walking is not an activity added onto life, but the medium through which life is carried out. And when we compare this to modern environments, the difference becomes clear, because resources are concentrated, distances are reduced, and protection from weather is readily available, which removes many of the pressures that once required constant movement, allowing stillness to become the default condition instead. And when stillness becomes normal, movement becomes optional, and when it is optional, it begins to feel more noticeable, more effortful, and more separate from the rest of daily life. And this shift in environmental structure changes not only how often the body moves, but how it experiences movement when it does occur, making the same act of walking feel more like a task and less like a natural extension of being in the world. And when viewed in this way, the ability of Ice Age humans to walk for long periods without feeling overwhelmed by fatigue is not the result of a single factor, but the outcome of a consistent alignment between body, perception, and environment, where each element supports the others, allowing movement to continue as a stable and necessary part of life, rather than an isolated demand placed on the body. In an environment where resources are spread out and conditions can change without warning, movement is not only frequent, it is structured by distance itself. And this creates a pattern where the body learns to think in terms of reaching rather than stopping, because each journey has a direction and a purpose that extends beyond the immediate moment. And when movement is guided by reaching a place rather than reacting to discomfort, the experience of walking begins to shift, since attention is placed on what lies ahead instead of what is being felt in each step. And this reduces the weight of fatigue as a deciding factor, not because it disappears, but because it is not the primary reference point for action. And in Ice Age landscapes, where familiar paths might stretch across open ground, along river edges, or between seasonal locations, this forward orientation would have been reinforced repeatedly, shaping a way of moving that is continuous and goal-linked rather than interrupted by frequent reassessment. And this matters because the body responds differently when movement is connected to an external objective as opposed to being performed for its own sake, since purpose can stabilize pace, reduce unnecessary variation, and help maintain a consistent level of effort that the body can sustain over time. And this consistency again supports the use of slower, more stable energy systems, preventing sudden increases in demand that would trigger stronger fatigue signals, and at the same time, the environment itself would have provided natural pacing cues, such as the need to cross a certain stretch of land before weather changed, or to reach a known shelter area before light faded, and these cues create a rhythm that is not dictated by internal sensation alone, but by an interaction between the body and the landscape. And this interaction reduces the likelihood of abrupt stops and starts, because movement is tied to broader patterns rather than moment-to-moment comfort. And over time, this leads to a form of endurance that is less about pushing limits and more about maintaining alignment with external demands. And this alignment can be observed even in modern contexts, where people walk with a clear destination, because the act often feels smoother and less tiring compared to walking without a defined endpoint, even if the distance is similar, suggesting that the structure of the task influences how effort is perceived and managed. And when we consider Ice Age humans, whose daily movement was consistently linked to survival-related goals, it becomes more likely that walking was experienced as a necessary and ongoing process rather than a series of optional efforts. And this distinction is important because optional effort invites evaluation and interruption, while necessary movement encourages continuity. And when continuity is maintained, the body can remain within a stable range of activity that avoids the extremes where fatigue becomes overwhelming. And in contrast, modern environments often remove the need for such continuity, allowing movement to be broken into shorter, less connected segments, which increases the frequency of transitions and the likelihood that fatigue will be noticed and acted upon. And this again highlights how closely the experience of tiredness is tied not only to physical capacity, but to the structure of the environment and the purpose that movement serves within it. And when those elements are aligned, as they were for Ice Age humans, walking becomes less of a challenge to overcome and more of a steady path that the body follows as part of its ordinary way of being in the world. When movement is shaped by distance, purpose, and environmental rhythm, another quiet effect begins to take place. Because the body is no longer responding only to internal signals, it is synchronizing with patterns that exist outside of itself. And this synchronization helps stabilize how effort is distributed over time, since the pace of walking is guided not by sudden decisions but by ongoing interaction with terrain, light, temperature, and the need to reach specific places. And in Ice Age conditions, where days could be structured by the movement of herds, the location of water, or the need to adjust to changing weather, this external structure would have provided a steady framework within which the body could operate, reducing the need for constant internal adjustment. And this matters because frequent internal adjustment often leads to inefficiency, small changes in pace, posture, or effort that accumulate and increase the overall cost of movement, while a stable, externally guided rhythm allows the body to settle into a consistent pattern that can be maintained with less strain. And over time, this reduces not only physical fatigue but also the variability that makes fatigue more noticeable, because when effort remains within a narrow range, the contrast between one moment and the next becomes smaller, and without sharp contrasts, the sensation of tiredness is less likely to stand out. And this effect is reinforced by the way natural environments encourage gradual transitions rather than abrupt changes, since terrain often shifts slowly rather than instantly, and light fades over time rather than suddenly, allowing the body to adjust without being forced into rapid shifts in effort. And in such conditions, walking becomes part of a continuous exchange between the body and its surroundings, where each step is influenced by what came before and what is about to come, rather than being isolated as a separate action. And this continuity supports a form of endurance that is not based on resisting fatigue, but on avoiding the conditions that make fatigue more intense. And when we compare this to modern environments, where movement is often separated from natural rhythms and placed into artificial structures such as fixed schedules, flat surfaces, and controlled climates, the difference becomes clearer because these conditions can introduce abrupt changes in activity, sharp starts and stops, and a lack of gradual transitions, all of which increase the likelihood that effort will be experienced as disruptive rather than continuous, and this disruption amplifies fatigue, making it more noticeable even when the physical demands are not greater. And in contrast, Ice Age humans moved within environments that naturally supported continuity, guiding their pace and distributing effort in a way that aligned with both the body's capabilities and the demands of the landscape. And when this alignment is maintained, walking does not need to overcome fatigue in a dramatic way, because fatigue is less likely to build into something that interrupts movement, and instead remains part of a steady background that does not dominate the experience. And this helps explain why long periods of walking could be sustained without feeling overwhelming, not because the body was free from limits, but because those limits were approached slowly, gradually, and in coordination with the world around them, rather than being reached abruptly through isolated bursts of effort. When movement is supported by the body, shaped by perception, and guided by the environment, there is still another factor that quietly determines how long it continues, and that is whether stopping is truly an option, because in many modern situations, Walking can be paused at almost any moment without consequence, which changes how the body and mind approach effort, since the presence of an easy alternative makes interruption more likely. But in Ice Age conditions, the situation was often different, not because early humans were forced to move without rest at all times, but because the timing of rest was constrained by factors that did not always align with comfort, such as the need to reach shelter before cold intensified, to stay within a group, or to follow a shifting resource across a landscape that did not offer immediate substitutes. And this limitation does not require constant urgency, but it does create a context in which movement tends to continue until a certain point is reached, rather than stopping whenever fatigue becomes noticeable. And over time, this shapes behavior in a predictable way, because when the body learns that movement will often continue despite mild discomfort, it begins to adjust its expectations, reducing the frequency with which early fatigue signals lead to action. And this is not a matter of ignoring the body, but of aligning responses with what is possible in the environment. And when the environment does not support frequent stopping, the internal system adapts by allowing movement to proceed within a wider range of sensation, and this adaptation can still be observed in situations where stopping is not immediately available, such as long walks between distant points, where people often find that they can continue longer than expected once they accept that the endpoint cannot be reached without sustained movement. And in these cases, the initial sense of fatigue may not disappear, but it often becomes less decisive, allowing the person to maintain a steady pace rather than interrupting movement repeatedly. And in Ice Age contexts, where similar constraints would have been common, this pattern would have been reinforced regularly, shaping a way of moving that is less dependent on moment-to-moment comfort and more oriented toward reaching necessary locations. And this has a subtle but important effect on how fatigue is experienced, because when stopping is less available, the body does not treat every signal of discomfort as a prompt for immediate change, and instead allows those signals to coexist with ongoing movement. And over time, this reduces the sense that fatigue is something that must be resolved quickly, and instead places it within a broader range of manageable sensations. And this does not imply that early humans were constantly pushing beyond safe limits, because rest still occurred when conditions allowed, but it does suggest that the decision to stop was more closely tied to external factors than to internal sensations alone. And when we compare this to modern life, where stopping is often easy and frequent, the difference becomes clearer because the threshold for interruption becomes lower, and fatigue is more likely to lead to immediate rest, even when the body is capable of continuing. And this repeated pattern reinforces the idea that walking is something that should be comfortable at all times. And when it is not, it is experienced as a problem, whereas in Ice Age environments, discomfort was more often part of the process rather than a signal to end it. And this shift in context helps explain why walking could continue for long periods without feeling overwhelmingly tiring, because the body was not constantly negotiating whether to stop, but was instead moving within a framework where continuation was often the default, and interruption was reserved for moments when it was truly possible or necessary. When stopping is not always available and movement continues as part of necessity rather than choice, the body begins to develop a quieter form of regulation that is easy to overlook, because instead of reacting strongly to each signal of discomfort, it learns to distribute effort in a way that prevents those signals from becoming overwhelming in the first place. And this shift changes the entire experience of walking, since fatigue is no longer something that arrives suddenly and demands attention, but something that rises slowly within a range the body can manage. And this is closely tied to how pacing emerges, because when the body expects that it must continue moving, it naturally avoids extremes, settling into a level of effort that can be sustained without forcing a stop. And this process does not require conscious control, but develops through repeated exposure to conditions where stopping is limited, shaping a form of movement that is steady, measured, and resistant to sudden exhaustion. And in Ice Age environments, where distances between resources could be large and conditions could change before a destination was reached, this kind of pacing would have been reinforced daily, encouraging movement that stays within the body's sustainable range rather than pushing beyond it. And over time, this leads to a different relationship with fatigue, because the body rarely enters the sharp peaks of effort that generate strong signals of tiredness, and instead remains within a narrower band where effort is noticeable but not disruptive, and this can be observed even in modern situations where people walk for long periods without the option to stop frequently. Because after an initial phase where fatigue is more apparent, the body often adjusts, finding a rhythm that allows continuation without repeated interruption. And this adjustment suggests that fatigue is not only a measure of how much energy has been used, but also of how smoothly the body is able to match its output to the demands placed on it. And when that match is stable, fatigue becomes less intense and less likely to dominate the experience. And in contrast, when movement is optional and easily interrupted, the body does not have the same opportunity to settle into this stable pattern, because each pause resets the process, requiring the system to begin again from a state of relative inactivity, which increases the cost of restarting and amplifies the sensation of effort. And this repeated cycle of starting and stopping creates a different kind of fatigue, one that is more abrupt and more noticeable, even if the total amount of movement is not greater. And over time, this pattern reinforces the idea that walking is something that should be comfortable and easily paused, and when it is not, it feels unusually demanding. Whereas in Ice Age conditions, the expectation was different, because movement often needed to continue until a certain point was reached, and this expectation allowed the body to organize itself around continuity rather than interruption, reducing the frequency with which fatigue led to stopping, and instead allowing it to exist as part of an ongoing process. And this does not mean that early humans ignored their limits, but that their limits were approached more gradually, within a system that prioritized steady progression over short-term comfort. And when movement is structured in this way, the body is less likely to encounter the kinds of sudden, overwhelming fatigue that often define modern experiences of walking, and more likely to maintain a consistent level of effort that can be carried over long distances without becoming a central burden, which helps explain why walking in Ice Age conditions could continue for extended periods without feeling as tiring as it often does today. When movement continues because it must, rather than because it is chosen, another quiet change takes place over longer periods of time, because the body begins to anticipate continuation before each step is even taken. And this anticipation shapes how effort is released from the start, preventing the sharp rise in energy output that often leads to early fatigue, and instead guiding the body into a controlled and measured state that can be sustained without interruption. And this matters because much of what people experience as tiredness during walking does not come only from the distance itself, but from the way the body enters and exits movement, especially when activity begins suddenly after stillness, causing muscles, circulation, and breathing to adjust quickly rather than gradually. And this rapid adjustment increases the sense of strain even if the total effort is not high. Whereas in Ice Age conditions, where movement rarely began from complete rest and often continued across long stretches of time, the body would have remained in a more constant state of readiness, allowing each step to follow smoothly from the previous one without requiring a full restart. And over time, this reduces the internal cost of beginning movement, making it feel less demanding even when repeated many times. And this continuity also affects how different systems in the body coordinate with one another, because when movement is sustained, breathing, heart rate, and muscle activity tend to align into a stable pattern, supporting one another instead of fluctuating independently. And this alignment reduces inefficiency, since fewer adjustments are needed to maintain balance between energy supply and demand, and when fewer adjustments are required, the body experiences less internal friction, which in turn lowers the overall sensation of effort. And this is one reason why steady walking can sometimes feel easier than shorter interrupted movement, because the body is allowed to remain within a consistent rhythm rather than being forced to repeatedly shift between states. And in Ice Age environments, this consistency would have been common, not because conditions were easy, but because the structure of daily life required it, with long distances, changing weather, and the need to reach specific locations, all encouraging a form of movement that avoided unnecessary variation. And over generations, this pattern would have shaped not only physical adaptation, but also expectation, so that movement was approached as something continuous rather than something that begins and ends repeatedly. And this expectation reduces the mental and physical impact of each individual step, since the body does not treat it as a separate effort, but as part of an ongoing flow. And when we compare this to modern life, Where movement is often broken into short segments surrounded by long periods of inactivity, the difference becomes clearer because each segment requires a new adjustment, increasing the cost of starting and amplifying the sensation of effort. And this repeated restarting can make even moderate walking feel more tiring than it might in a continuous context. And over time, this pattern reinforces the perception that walking itself is demanding, when in fact much of that demand comes from the interruptions that surround it. And when we return to the experience of Ice Age humans, it becomes easier to see that their ability to walk for long periods without feeling overwhelmed by fatigue was not based on pushing beyond limits, but on living within a pattern that reduced the need to approach those limits abruptly, allowing movement to continue in a stable, predictable way that the body could sustain without constant strain. And when movement is sustained in this manner, fatigue does not disappear, but it becomes quieter, slower, and less likely to interrupt the ongoing rhythm of life. When a movement is repeated not just for days or months but across entire lifetimes, the body does not simply perform it more often, it begins to reorganize itself around that repetition in a deeper way. And this is especially true for muscles because muscle tissue is not fixed. It changes gradually depending on how it is used, becoming more suited to the types of effort it performs most frequently. And in the case of Ice Age humans, where walking was a constant part of daily life from an early age, this repeated low-intensity movement would have encouraged muscles to develop in a way that supports endurance rather than short bursts of power. And this distinction is important, because endurance-oriented muscle function relies on the ability to sustain activity over long periods with a steady supply of energy, while power-oriented function is designed for brief, intense efforts that cannot be maintained for long. And when muscles are used continuously in a moderate range, they adapt by improving their ability to use oxygen efficiently, coordinate contractions smoothly, and avoid unnecessary tension, all of which reduce the overall cost of movement and delay the onset of fatigue. And these changes do not require extreme training or conscious effort, but emerge naturally from repetition, as the body adjusts to what it does most often, and this process begins early in life, meaning that individuals who grow up in environments where movement is constant develop these patterns as part of their baseline function, rather than needing to build them later. And this developmental aspect is important, because it shapes not only physical capacity but also how movement feels, since a body that is adapted to continuous activity experiences less friction and resistance when performing it, making the same action feel more natural and less tiring. And this can be observed in modern contexts where individuals who walk regularly over long periods often report that distances which once felt difficult become easier without a dramatic increase in strength, suggesting that the change lies not only in how much force the muscles can produce, but in how efficiently they can sustain repeated contractions over time. And when we apply this understanding to Ice Age humans, it becomes clear that their muscles were not necessarily stronger in an absolute sense, but were more consistently tuned to the demands of steady movement, allowing them to operate within a range that supports long-duration activity without generating excessive fatigue. And this adaptation would have been reinforced across generations, as those who were better able to sustain movement within their environment were more likely to succeed in obtaining resources and maintaining group stability. And over time, this would contribute to a population where endurance in walking was not exceptional, but expected. And this expectation further shapes behavior, since individuals are more likely to continue activities that feel manageable within their physical limits. And when those limits are aligned with continuous movement, walking becomes less of a challenge and more of a default condition. And in contrast, modern patterns of life often limit repeated low-intensity movement, reducing the opportunity for muscles to maintain this endurance-oriented adaptation. And as a result, even though the basic structure of the body remains similar, the way it responds to sustained walking changes, with fatigue appearing earlier and more noticeably, not because the body has lost its capacity entirely, but because it is no longer operating within the conditions that support that capacity. And when we consider this difference, it becomes easier to understand why Ice Age humans could walk for long periods without feeling overwhelmed by tiredness, because their muscles were shaped by repetition, their energy use was steady, and their environment required continuous movement, creating a system where endurance was not a special ability, but a natural outcome of how life was lived. When the same kind of movement is repeated across years, the muscles do more than become familiar with it. They begin to specialize around it, quietly changing the way they use fuel, the way they resist strain, and the way they coordinate with the rest of the body. And this helps explain why walking could remain so sustainable for Ice Age humans, because their muscles were not being asked to switch constantly between long stillness and short effort, as often happens now, but were living inside a pattern of regular, repeated use that favored endurance over interruption. And endurance in this sense does not mean dramatic power or unusual toughness. It means the capacity to keep producing moderate force again and again, without wasting too much energy or building fatigue too quickly. And muscles become better at this when they are used in steady, low-intensity ways over long periods, because repeated use encourages them to support oxygen-based energy production more effectively, improves the fine coordination of contraction, and reduces unnecessary tension that would otherwise increase the cost of each step. And once these changes accumulate, movement begins to feel smoother, not only because the muscles can keep working longer, but because they are working with less friction inside the system. And this kind of adaptation is especially important for walking, since walking depends less on one large effort than on thousands of small efforts joined together. And if each of those efforts costs even slightly less, the total difference across hours becomes substantial. And this is why repeated walking from an early age matters so much, because it does not simply make the legs stronger. It teaches the entire muscular system to treat steady movement as normal, so that effort is distributed more evenly and fatigue rises more slowly. And this developmental pattern would have mattered greatly in Ice Age life, where children likely grew into bodies that were already shaped by frequent movement across real terrain, uneven surfaces, cold ground, and long daily distances, meaning that the muscle system supporting endurance was not added later as a form of training, but built gradually into ordinary existence. And this helps explain why sustained walking would not have felt extraordinary, because what feels extraordinary is often what lies outside the body's usual pattern, while what is repeated enough becomes almost invisible in sensation. And muscle adaptation works in exactly that quiet way, by making the repeated task less costly, less abrupt, and less likely to trigger strong fatigue signals. And this does not mean that Ice Age humans had some lost kind of muscle that modern humans no longer possess, because the basic human body remains deeply similar, but it does mean that muscle function depends heavily on daily use, and when daily use changes, the experience of walking changes with it. And in modern life, many people spend long periods seated, then ask the muscles to work in short, separate blocks, and this pattern supports less continuity, less refinement, and less endurance-specific adaptation. So even though the body still carries the old design for sustained movement, it is no longer maintained in the same way, and as a result, muscles may tighten more quickly, coordination may feel less natural, and the body may reach noticeable fatigue sooner, not because it has lost its evolutionary foundation, but because it is not repeating the conditions that once kept that foundation active. And when we return to Ice Age humans with this in mind, the picture becomes calmer and more realistic, because their advantage was not magical stamina, but repetition. And repetition is powerful precisely because it changes the body without needing spectacle, shaping muscle fibers, circulation, timing, and posture little by little until walking becomes not a challenge to overcome, but a stable condition. The body can remain inside for long stretches of time, and once movement is repeated enough to be built into the muscles themselves, the body stops treating walking as something extra, and begins once again to treat it as one of the most ordinary things it knows how to do. When a pattern of movement is repeated not only within a single lifetime, but across many generations, its effects extend beyond individual muscles and begin to shape how the body as a whole expects to function. And this expectation matters because it influences not only physical capacity, but also how quickly the body responds to strain, how it distributes effort, and how it maintains balance over long periods of activity. And in the case of Ice Age humans, where walking was a constant part of survival across generations, this repetition would have reinforced a shared baseline in which sustained movement was not unusual, but built into the way the body operated from early development onward. And this does not require assuming any dramatic biological difference from modern humans, because the underlying human form remains largely the same. but it does suggest that the expression of that form depends strongly on repeated use, and when use is consistent across time, the body stabilizes around it, reducing variability and making movement more predictable and less costly. And this stability plays an important role in how fatigue is experienced, because when the body can rely on familiar patterns, it avoids many of the small disruptions that increase effort, allowing activity to continue without frequent interruption. And this is especially true for walking, where each step builds on the previous one, and consistency in timing, posture, and muscle engagement helps maintain a steady rhythm that can be carried over long distances. And when this rhythm is well established, it reduces the likelihood that any single moment of discomfort will grow into a dominant sensation, since the overall pattern remains intact. And this helps explain why endurance in walking does not necessarily come from pushing limits, but from rarely disturbing the balance that keeps movement sustainable. And in Ice Age environments, where conditions repeatedly demanded such balance, this pattern would have been reinforced across generations, not through conscious effort, but through the simple fact that those who could maintain steady movement were better able to navigate the landscape, locate resources, and remain within the group. And over time, this would contribute to a population where sustained walking was part of ordinary life rather than an exceptional ability. And this generational continuity also affects how individuals grow into their bodies, because when children are exposed to consistent movement from an early age, their coordination, muscle function, and perception of effort develop within that context, creating a baseline where walking feels natural and manageable rather than demanding. And in contrast, when movement is less consistent during development, the body may still be capable of endurance, but it does not begin from the same stable foundation. And this difference can influence how quickly fatigue appears and how strongly it is felt, even if the underlying biological potential remains similar. And when we compare this to modern patterns, where daily movement is often reduced and unevenly distributed, the contrast becomes clearer, because the generational continuity of sustained walking has been interrupted. And although the human body still carries the structures that support endurance, those structures are no longer reinforced in the same consistent way, leading to a situation where walking can feel more effortful than it might in a different context. And this does not mean that modern humans have lost the ability to walk long distances, but that the conditions which once supported that ability as a natural state are no longer present. And without those conditions, the body responds differently, making fatigue more noticeable and more central to the experience of movement. And when we return to the question of Ice Age humans, the answer becomes less about exceptional resilience and more about continuity, because when movement is repeated across days, years, and generations, it becomes embedded in the body at multiple levels, reducing the cost of each step and allowing walking to continue as a steady, ongoing part of life without becoming overwhelming. If repetition shapes the body and continuity shapes behavior, then the feeling of fatigue itself must also be understood as something that can change over time, because fatigue is not a fixed signal that always appears in the same way under the same conditions. It is influenced by how the body and brain interpret ongoing activity, and this interpretation can shift depending on what the body has become used to experiencing. And in the context of Ice Age humans, where walking was constant and necessary, the signals that indicated effort would have been calibrated differently, not to eliminate fatigue, but to prevent it from interrupting movement too early. And this calibration is important because the body does not simply measure physical strain, it decides how strongly to respond to it. And that decision is shaped by repeated exposure to similar conditions, meaning that when the same level of effort is experienced frequently and does not lead to harm, the body gradually reduces the urgency of its signals, allowing activity to continue without constant disruption. And this process can be observed in modern situations where people engage in regular, repeated movement, because over time, activities that once felt tiring begin to feel more manageable, even if the physical demands remain similar, suggesting that the perception of fatigue has been adjusted, not just the physical capacity. And this adjustment does not require conscious control, but emerges from the interaction between the nervous system and the environment. As the body learns which signals require immediate action and which can remain in the background, and in Ice Age environments, where movement was continuous and stopping was not always an immediate option, this learning process would have been reinforced repeatedly, encouraging a form of regulation where fatigue signals were present but less dominant, allowing the body to operate within a sustainable range without being constantly interrupted. And this does not mean that early humans ignored their limits or pushed beyond safe boundaries, but that their limits were approached more gradually, within a system that avoided sudden spikes in effort and instead maintained a steady flow. And this steady flow reduces the likelihood that fatigue will reach a level that demands immediate cessation, since the body is not being pushed far beyond its current state. And when we compare this to modern patterns, where movement is often irregular and includes periods of higher intensity after long inactivity, the difference becomes clearer, because the body is more likely to experience rapid changes in effort, which trigger stronger fatigue signals and create a sense of sudden tiredness, even during relatively short activities. And this contrast highlights how much of the experience of fatigue depends not only on the amount of work being done, but on how that work is structured over time. And when work is distributed evenly and continuously, as it was for Ice Age humans, fatigue becomes less abrupt and less disruptive, allowing walking to continue as part of a stable pattern rather than a repeated challenge. And this suggests that the reason walking did not feel as tiring in those conditions is not that fatigue was absent, but that it was shaped by a different set of expectations, one in which ongoing movement was normal and the signals that accompanied it were calibrated to support that normal state rather than interrupt it at the earliest sign of discomfort. When fatigue signals are shaped by repetition and environment, they begin to follow patterns that reflect what the body expects, rather than what it is strictly capable of. And this expectation plays a quiet but powerful role in how effort is experienced during walking, because the body does not wait until energy is completely depleted before signaling tiredness. It anticipates future demand and adjusts behavior early. And when that anticipation is based on a life where movement is continuous, the signals are tuned to allow continuation, rising slowly and remaining within a range that does not interrupt activity. And this is important because it shows that fatigue is not only a response to what has already happened, but also a prediction about what might happen next. And in Ice Age environments, where stopping was not always possible and movement often needed to continue over long distances, this predictive system would have been shaped to avoid triggering strong fatigue responses too early, since doing so would interfere with the ability to reach necessary destinations. And over time, this creates a different balance between caution and continuation, where the body still protects itself from extreme strain, but allows moderate effort to persist without constant interruption. And this balance can still be observed in modern situations where individuals engage in sustained, predictable activity, because when the body recognizes a familiar pattern, it adjusts its signals to match that pattern, reducing the intensity of fatigue at a given level of effort. And this suggests that part of what makes walking feel tiring today is not only the physical demand, but the uncertainty surrounding it, especially when movement is irregular and not integrated into daily life, because uncertainty leads the body to signal fatigue earlier as a way of protecting against unknown limits. And this can make even moderate distances feel more demanding than they might in a more stable context. And in contrast, Ice Age humans lived within patterns of movement that were repeated daily, reducing uncertainty and allowing the body to calibrate its responses more precisely. And this precision lowers the need for strong, early warnings, since the system has learned what levels of effort can be sustained safely, and as a result, fatigue becomes a gradual and manageable sensation rather than a sudden barrier. And this does not eliminate the need for rest, but changes when and how rest is initiated, making it more closely tied to external conditions such as reaching a suitable location or completing a necessary task, rather than to the first appearance of discomfort. And when we compare this to modern life, where movement is often less predictable and more easily interrupted, the difference becomes clear because the body is less able to form stable expectations, leading to a more cautious response that amplifies fatigue signals even during relatively light activity. And over time, this pattern reinforces the perception that walking is tiring, when in fact, much of that tiredness arises from how the body anticipates and interprets effort, rather than from the effort itself. And when viewed in this way, the experience of Ice Age humans becomes easier to understand, not as a state without fatigue, but as a state where fatigue was calibrated differently, shaped by repetition, necessity, and predictability into a form that allowed movement to continue as a steady and uninterrupted part of life. When fatigue is shaped not only by immediate effort, but also by expectation, repetition, and the body's own predictions, it begins to behave less like a hard wall and more like a moving boundary. And this matters because a moving boundary can change the entire experience of walking without changing the basic structure of the human body itself, since the body does not wait until it is fully run out of energy before producing the feeling of tiredness, but instead sends signals earlier, estimating what level of effort can probably be sustained and what level might become risky if continued too long. And this makes fatigue partly protective, partly predictive, and deeply influenced by context, which means that the same person can feel very different levels of tiredness under different patterns of life, even when the act of walking looks similar from the outside. And in the case of Ice Age humans, this predictive system would have been shaped by constant exposure to regular movement across real landscapes, where walking was not rare, optional, or sharply separated from the rest of life, but repeated so often that the body had a stable record of what sustained movement usually meant. And when the body has that kind of repeated record, it becomes more accurate in its responses, less likely to overreact to moderate effort, and better able to allow movement to continue without producing strong early signals that demand a stop. And this is important because much of what people now call fatigue may often be an early warning, amplified by unfamiliarity, inconsistency, or uncertainty, rather than a sign that the body has truly approached its deepest limit. And when uncertainty is high, the nervous system tends to become more cautious, sending stronger or earlier signals to preserve safety. But when uncertainty is low, because the pattern is familiar and frequently repeated, those same signals can remain quieter and more gradual, allowing effort to unfold over longer periods without becoming overwhelming. And this helps explain why regular walking in modern life often begins to feel easier after repetition, even before major changes in visible fitness occur, because the body is not only becoming somewhat more efficient, it is also becoming less alarmed by the prospect of continued movement. And once that happens, the threshold at which walking begins to feel significantly tiring starts to shift outward, not infinitely, not dramatically, but enough to change daily experience in a meaningful way. And in Ice Age conditions, this outward shift would likely have been reinforced from early development onward, because children growing up inside a mobile way of life would have learned movement not as a challenge to prepare for, but as part of ordinary existence, which means their nervous systems, muscles, and expectations would have matured inside a pattern of continuity rather than interruption. And continuity matters because it gives the body a stable basis for prediction, allowing it to distinguish between manageable effort and true threat with greater precision. And where precision increases, unnecessary fatigue signals can decrease, and when those signals decrease, walking ceases to feel like a repeated negotiation with discomfort and becomes instead a steady background process that supports the larger tasks of life. And this does not mean Ice Age humans never felt tired, because they certainly would have felt hunger, cold, strain, injury, and exhaustion under harsh conditions. But it does suggest that the ordinary fatigue of sustained walking was less likely to arrive as an intrusive barrier, because the body was calibrated to expect continuation and to manage it with relative confidence. And this is where the difference with modern life becomes especially clear. Since many modern bodies live in patterns of irregular movement, long indoor stillness, and frequent interruption, which weakens the stability of prediction and encourages a more cautious response to effort, making fatigue appear earlier and feel more central even when the underlying biological machinery remains largely the same. And so the deeper answer is not that Ice Age humans possessed a mysterious endurance modern humans have lost forever, but that their bodies were calibrated by a life of repetition, necessity, and environmental continuity, and within that calibration the boundary of fatigue sat in a different place, farther from the first steps, quieter in its signals, and less able to interrupt the long, steady movement that shaped so much of human existence. If the body, perception, and environment once worked together to keep walking steady and sustainable, then the modern experience of walking must be understood not as a loss of ability, but as a shift in baseline, because the conditions that once supported continuous movement have changed in ways that are subtle but consistent, and this change begins with how daily life is structured. Since in many modern settings, movement is no longer required to access food, shelter, or safety in the same direct way, and as a result, long periods of stillness become normal, not as a temporary pause within movement, but as the dominant condition of the day. And this reversal matters because the body adapts not to what it is capable of, but to what it is repeatedly asked to do. And when stillness is repeated more often than movement, the baseline begins to shift toward inactivity, reshaping how muscles, circulation, and coordination operate over time. And this does not remove the body's capacity for endurance, but it changes how easily that capacity is accessed, making sustained walking feel more effortful because it lies further from the body's current state. And one of the clearest effects of this shift appears in how movement begins, because when a person starts walking after long inactivity, the body must transition from a low-energy, low-movement state into an active one. And this transition requires adjustments in muscle activation, blood flow, breathing, and balance, all of which increase the initial cost of movement and contribute to the early sensation of fatigue, even if the total distance is not great. And this contrasts with Ice Age conditions, where movement rarely began from complete stillness, and the body remained closer to an active state throughout the day, reducing the cost of beginning and maintaining motion. And over time, repeated transitions from stillness to movement in modern life can reinforce a pattern where walking is consistently experienced as something that requires effort to start. And once something requires effort to start, it is more likely to be perceived as tiring even before significant energy has been used. And this perception is further shaped by the structure of modern environments, where flat surfaces, controlled temperatures, and predictable surroundings reduce the need for constant low-level adjustment. And while this may seem to make movement easier, it also reduces the body's exposure to the variations that once helped maintain coordination and efficiency, leading to a form of movement that is less practiced in its natural context, and therefore more noticeable when it occurs. And this noticeability contributes to the sense that walking is an activity rather than a condition, something that stands apart from the rest of life rather than blending into it. And once movement stands apart, it becomes something to evaluate, to measure, and to decide whether to continue, which increases the likelihood that fatigue will be recognized and acted upon earlier. And this creates a feedback loop where walking feels tiring, is performed less often, and therefore remains less integrated into daily life, reinforcing the very conditions that make it feel effortful. And when we compare this to the experience of Ice Age humans, the difference becomes clearer, because their baseline was built around continuous movement, while the modern baseline is often built around stillness. And this difference in baseline does not change the fundamental design of the human body, but it changes how that design is expressed in everyday experience, shifting the point at which walking begins to feel tiring and altering the way fatigue emerges over time. And this helps explain why walking, something that once formed the background of life, can now feel like a distinct effort, not because it has become more difficult in an absolute sense, but because it has become less familiar, less continuous, and less supported by the patterns that once made it feel natural. When the baseline of life shifts towards stillness, the meaning of movement changes in ways that are deeper than simple fitness, because the body no longer treats walking as the background condition of existence, but as an event that interrupts rest. And once movement becomes an interruption, it begins to carry a different psychological and physical weight, since anything that interrupts the body's dominant pattern is more likely to be noticed, measured, and experienced as effort. And this is one of the quietest but most important differences between modern humans and those who lived in Ice Age conditions, because the older pattern was built around continuity, while the modern pattern is built around separation, with movement placed into smaller blocks that are divided from the rest of the day by long periods of sitting, waiting, riding, or remaining indoors. And this separation has consequences that build slowly, because the body becomes less practiced at linking one movement to the next, less familiar with sustaining low-intensity effort across long durations, and more likely to interpret even moderate walking as something outside its usual rhythm. And when that happens, tiredness begins to appear earlier, not always because the body has less capacity, but because the body is operating farther away from its habitual state. And that distance between the habitual state and the demanded action creates friction, and friction, repeated enough times, becomes fatigue, and this can be seen in the simple fact that many people today do not become tired only after long walks, but often at the beginning of them, when the body is still trying to leave the stillness it has adapted to, adjusting circulation, posture, breathing, stride length, and balance all at once. And these early adjustments create a sense of effort that is often mistaken for the true cost of walking itself, even though much of it comes from the transition into movement rather than the movement once fully underway. And this is where the contrast with Ice Age life becomes especially clear, because in a world where movement was woven through food gathering, travel, shelter, and social life, the body would have spent far less time in complete inactivity, meaning that walking rarely had to overcome such a sharp transition. And because the transition was smaller, the first stages of movement would have felt less heavy, less awkward, and less draining, allowing the person to enter a stable rhythm more quickly. And once rhythm arrives, fatigue often remains quieter, because the body is no longer repeatedly correcting itself or struggling to organize effort across disconnected systems. And this helps explain why modern life does not merely reduce movement, but actually rewrites the terms under which movement is felt, making it seem more tiring than it might have felt in an older human context, and that rewriting extends beyond the body into expectation, because when daily life is designed so that many basic needs can be met without walking very far, the mind no longer assumes movement as normal either, and what the mind does not assume, it tends to evaluate more closely, asking whether the effort is necessary, whether it is comfortable, whether it should continue, and this constant evaluation raises the prominence of fatigue, making the same physical sensation feel more important than it would in a life where walking was simply part of the ongoing structure of the day. And over time, this creates a loop in which reduced movement lowers familiarity, lower familiarity increases perceived effort, and increased perceived effort makes future movement less likely to feel natural, and the body settles even further into stillness, not because it was designed for stillness, but because it adapts to repetition wherever repetition leads. And so the real modern change is not that humans lost the ancient capacity to walk for long distances, but that daily life no longer keeps that capacity near the surface. And when a capacity is no longer kept near the surface, it begins to feel distant. And when it feels distant, even ordinary walking starts to resemble a task rather than a condition, a demand rather than a flow. And that is why the modern body can still carry the old human design, while experiencing movement in a very different way from the humans who once crossed cold landscapes without letting ordinary walking become the central story of their fatigue. When movement becomes separated from the main structure of daily life, another effect begins to appear that is easy to miss, because it does not come from the body alone, but from how time itself is organized. And this matters because in modern settings, time is often divided into distinct segments, with clear beginnings and endings for activities, and walking is placed into one of those segments, given a start, a duration, and an end, which turns it into something that must be completed rather than something that quietly continues. And once walking is framed in this way, it becomes easier to measure, to compare, and to judge, and this increases awareness of effort, since each moment can be evaluated against a sense of progress or expectation, and when effort is constantly evaluated, fatigue becomes more visible, not necessarily because it is stronger, but because attention is repeatedly drawn to it, and this repeated attention amplifies the experience, making the same physical sensation feel more central than it might in a different context. And in contrast, Ice Age humans lived within a structure of time that was less segmented and more continuous, where movement was not confined to a specific block but spread across the day, connected to changing light, shifting weather, and the location of resources. And in such a structure, walking did not begin at a clear starting point or end at a fixed moment, but flowed between tasks, making it less likely to be isolated and evaluated as a separate effort. And this reduces the prominence of fatigue, because when an activity is not framed as a task with a defined endpoint, the mind has fewer opportunities to compare current sensation with an expected finish. And without that comparison, discomfort is less likely to become the focus of attention, and this difference can still be observed today in situations where people move without a strict schedule, such as during long, unstructured walks, where time seems to pass differently and effort often feels less intrusive, even if the distance covered is similar. suggesting that the way time is organized influences how fatigue is perceived. And in Ice Age conditions, where movement was guided more by external factors than by fixed schedules, this unstructured flow would have been common, allowing the body to operate within a continuous rhythm that did not require constant reassessment. And this continuity supports a more stable experience of effort, since the body is not repeatedly starting, stopping, and measuring progress, but simply continuing within a changing environment. And over time, this reduces the sense that walking is something that must be endured, because it is no longer framed as a discrete challenge, but as part of an ongoing process. And when we compare this to modern life, where walking is often confined to specific times and evaluated in terms of distance, duration, or performance, the difference becomes clearer because the act of measuring and structuring movement increases awareness of effort and makes fatigue more noticeable, even if the physical demand is not greater. And this suggests that part of what has changed is not the capacity to walk, but the context in which walking takes place. And when context changes, perception changes with it, altering how the same activity is experienced. And in the case of Ice Age humans, walking existed within a flow of time that did not isolate it as a task. And because it was not isolated, it did not carry the same sense of effort or fatigue that emerges when movement is separated, measured, and placed against a fixed expectation. And this helps explain why walking could continue for long periods without becoming the dominant experience of tiredness, not because fatigue was absent, but because it was not constantly brought into focus by the way life was organized around it. When the continuity of movement is broken not only by environment and time structure, but by daily habit, the body begins to lose something that is difficult to notice at first, because it is not a loss of ability in a direct sense, but a gradual fading of connection between one movement and the next. And this fading matters because walking is not a single action, it is a chain of actions linked together, and the strength of that chain depends on how smoothly each step transitions into the next without interruption. And when interruptions become frequent, the chain weakens, forcing the body to rebuild coordination again and again instead of maintaining it. And this repeated rebuilding increases the cost of movement, not in a dramatic way for each step, but in small increments that accumulate over time. And these small increments are often experienced as early fatigue, stiffness, or a sense that walking requires more effort than expected, even when the distance is not great. And in modern life, where movement is often divided into short segments separated by long periods of stillness, this pattern becomes common because the body is repeatedly asked to begin moving from a state that is not prepared for continuous motion, and each beginning carries a cost. As muscles must activate, joints must adjust, circulation must increase, and the nervous system must reorganize coordination. And while each of these processes is natural, their repeated activation without sustained continuation creates inefficiency, making the act of walking feel heavier than it would in a more continuous context. And this stands in contrast to Ice Age conditions, where movement was less likely to be broken into isolated segments and more likely to continue across extended periods, allowing the body to maintain coordination without needing to restart it frequently. And when coordination is maintained, the body operates more smoothly, reducing unnecessary tension and conserving energy, which in turn lowers the sensation of fatigue. And this effect becomes more pronounced over time, because the longer a continuous pattern is maintained, the more stable it becomes, and the less effort is required to sustain it. And this stability is not only physical but also perceptual, as the mind becomes less aware of individual steps and more focused on the broader context of movement, reducing the prominence of fatigue signals. And when we compare this to modern patterns, the difference becomes clearer, because frequent interruptions prevent the body from reaching this stable state, keeping movement in a phase where coordination is still being established rather than maintained. And this ongoing disruption contributes to the feeling that walking is tiring, not because the body cannot handle it, but because it is rarely allowed to settle into the condition that makes it easier. And over time, this creates a feedback loop where walking feels effortful, is performed less often or for shorter durations, and therefore remains less integrated into daily life, reinforcing the conditions that make it feel demanding. And when we return to the experience of Ice Age humans, it becomes easier to understand that their ability to walk for long periods without feeling overwhelmed by fatigue was not based on pushing through discomfort repeatedly, but on avoiding the repeated loss of continuity that makes movement more costly, allowing them to remain within a steady pattern where each step supported the next without requiring constant reorganization. And in that pattern, fatigue remained present but did not dominate, because the body was not being forced to rebuild its rhythm again and again, but was allowed to carry it forward over time as part of a continuous and unbroken flow. When continuity is broken often enough, the body does not simply become less efficient in the moment, it begins to lose the deeper rhythm that once allowed movement to feel stable over long periods. And this loss of rhythm changes how walking unfolds from the inside, because instead of entering a steady state where effort, breathing, and coordination align, the body remains in a state of adjustment, never fully settling. And this constant adjustment creates a quiet instability where each step requires slightly more attention, slightly more correction, and slightly more energy than it would in a continuous flow. And over time, these small increases accumulate into a noticeable sense of effort, even when the distance is not great. And this is one reason why modern walking can feel tiring in a way that is not directly tied to distance or terrain, but to how fragmented the movement has become, because fragmentation prevents the body from reaching the point where movement becomes automatic and self-sustaining, and instead keeps it in an early phase where systems are still aligning. And this early phase is often where fatigue is most noticeable, not because the body is close to its limits, but because it has not yet settled into a pattern that minimizes internal resistance. And in Ice Age conditions, where movement was more likely to continue without frequent interruption, this settling phase would have been reached and maintained for longer periods, allowing the body to operate within a stable rhythm that reduces both physical and perceptual effort. And this rhythm is not something that appears instantly. It emerges gradually as the body aligns multiple systems into a consistent pattern, and once established, it can carry movement forward with less conscious control, reducing the need for constant correction and lowering the overall cost of each step. And this is why sustained walking often begins to feel easier after a certain point, because the body has moved past the unstable phase and into a more efficient state. And when this transition is prevented by frequent stops and starts, the body is repeatedly brought back to the beginning, where effort feels higher and fatigue signals are more prominent. And over time, this repeated return to the beginning reinforces the idea that walking itself is tiring, when in fact the tiring aspect comes from never fully leaving the phase of adjustment. And this effect is further amplified by modern environments that reduce variation in movement, because flat surfaces and controlled conditions limit the need for continuous micro-adjustments that help maintain coordination, and without those adjustments, the body becomes less practiced in sustaining rhythm across changing conditions, making it more sensitive to disruption when movement does occur. And when we compare this to the experience of Ice Age humans, the difference becomes clearer, because their movement was embedded within a landscape that required ongoing adaptation, encouraging the development and maintenance of a stable rhythm that could accommodate variation without losing continuity. And within that rhythm, walking did not need to overcome repeated instability, because it rarely left the state in which it could be sustained with relative ease. And this helps explain why long periods of movement could continue without becoming overwhelmingly tiring, not because the body was immune to fatigue, but because it was allowed to move within a pattern that minimized the conditions that make fatigue more intense. And when that pattern is lost, as it often is in modern life, walking begins to feel heavier, not as a result of distance alone, but as a consequence of a body that is no longer able to remain within the steady rhythm it was once shaped to sustain. When the body is repeatedly prevented from entering and maintaining a steady rhythm, something else begins to fade that is not immediately visible, because it is not only the mechanics of movement that are affected, but the sense of continuity that allows the body to trust its own motion over time. And this trust is important because when movement is familiar and uninterrupted, the body does not need to constantly check whether it can continue, it simply continues. But when movement is fragmented, that quiet trust weakens, and each period of walking begins to feel like a separate event that must be assessed again from the beginning. And this repeated assessment increases the sense of effort, since the mind is drawn back into evaluating each step, each change in pace, and each signal of discomfort. And when attention returns to these details again and again, fatigue becomes more noticeable, not necessarily because it is stronger, but because it is being observed more closely and more frequently, and this creates a subtle but powerful shift, where walking is no longer something that carries the body forward without interruption, but something that must be managed, monitored, and sometimes negotiated, and this negotiation adds a layer of mental effort to the physical act, increasing the overall sense of tiredness even when the body is capable of continuing. And this effect can be seen in how people often describe fatigue today, not only in terms of physical strain, but in terms of how aware they are of that strain, how often they think about stopping, and how quickly they evaluate whether the activity should continue. And this pattern reflects a body that is no longer embedded in continuous movement, but instead operates in segments, where each segment invites evaluation, and each evaluation increases the prominence of fatigue. And in Ice Age environments, where movement was less segmented and more continuous, this pattern of repeated assessment would have been less common, because the body and mind were oriented toward maintaining motion rather than deciding whether to continue it. And this orientation reduces the mental weight of movement, allowing walking to proceed without constant interruption from internal questions. And when the mental component of fatigue is reduced, the overall experience of effort becomes lighter, even if the physical work remains the same. And this helps explain why sustained walking can feel less tiring when it becomes habitual and continuous, because the need to monitor and evaluate each moment decreases, allowing the body to operate within a more automatic and stable pattern. And in contrast, when modern life repeatedly interrupts movement, it also interrupts this automaticity, forcing the body to re-establish coordination and the mind to re-engage in evaluation each time movement begins again. And over time, this repeated interruption reinforces the idea that walking is something that requires attention and effort, rather than something that can unfold quietly in the background. And when walking is experienced in this way, fatigue becomes more central, not because the body has become weaker, but because the conditions that once allowed movement to remain continuous and less observed are no longer present. And this shift reveals that part of the tiredness people feel while walking today is not simply a matter of physical limitation, but a consequence of a life where movement has been divided, interrupted, and brought into focus repeatedly, changing not only how the body moves, but how it experiences that movement from moment to moment. Even after all these shifts in rhythm, environment, and daily structure, something important remains unchanged, because the human body has not been redesigned in a short period of time, and the deeper structures that once supported long periods of walking are still present, even if they are not used in the same way. And this creates a quiet tension between what the body is capable of and what it is accustomed to doing. Since capacity can persist even when it is no longer expressed regularly, and this is important because it means that the experience of fatigue today does not necessarily reflect a permanent loss, but often reflects a difference in activation, a body that still carries an older pattern but does not remain within it long enough for it to become stable again. And this can be seen in situations where people gradually return to regular walking over time, because although the first attempts may feel tiring, the body often begins to adjust, and distances that once felt difficult become more manageable, not through sudden transformation, but through the slow reappearance of patterns that were always present beneath the surface. And this reappearance suggests that the capacity for sustained movement is not entirely lost but dormant, waiting for conditions that allow it to be expressed again. And when those conditions begin to resemble continuity rather than interruption, the body starts to reorganize itself in familiar ways, improving coordination, stabilizing energy use, and reducing unnecessary effort, all of which contribute to a quieter experience of fatigue. And this process does not require extreme training or exceptional discipline, but depends more on repetition and consistency, because the body responds to what is done regularly rather than what is done occasionally. And this reinforces the idea that the difference between modern humans and Ice Age humans is not rooted in a fundamental biological gap, but in how daily life is structured, and how often the body is allowed to remain within a pattern of sustained movement. And when that pattern is absent, fatigue becomes more noticeable, not because the body is incapable, but because it is operating outside its most stable mode. And when the pattern begins to return, even in a limited way, the experience of walking begins to change, becoming smoother, less abrupt, and less dominated by the need to stop. And this change can happen gradually, often without dramatic awareness, as the body adjusts step by step, and as this adjustment continues, the boundary at which walking feels tiring may shift outward again, allowing longer periods of movement without the same sense of effort. And this does not recreate the exact conditions of Ice Age life, because modern environments remain different in many ways, but it does reveal that the underlying design of the human body still carries the imprint of a past where walking was continuous and necessary. And that imprint continues to influence how movement can feel when the right patterns are re-established. And this helps explain why the ability to walk for long periods without overwhelming fatigue has not disappeared, but has become less visible, less practiced, and more dependent on how closely modern life aligns, even briefly, with the conditions that once shaped it. If the capacity for sustained walking still exists within the body, even when it is not regularly expressed, then the experience of fatigue begins to depend less on what the body lacks, and more on how that capacity is approached, because a body that carries an unused pattern does not immediately return to it in a stable way, but must move through a period of readjustment where effort feels more noticeable, more uneven, and sometimes more tiring than expected. And this phase is important because it reveals how much of walking depends on continuity rather than isolated ability, since the first attempts to re-enter sustained movement often feel heavier, not because the body cannot continue, but because it has not yet settled into the rhythm that makes continuation easier, and during this phase, muscles may activate less smoothly, coordination may require more attention, and the balance between energy use and energy supply may fluctuate more than it would in a well-established pattern, all of which contribute to the sensation of fatigue, even at moderate levels of effort, and this can create the impression that endurance has been lost, when in fact it is simply not yet stabilized, and as repetition continues, these fluctuations begin to decrease, and the body gradually aligns its systems into a more consistent pattern, reducing unnecessary tension, improving timing between movements, and distributing effort more evenly across time. And this gradual alignment does not produce a sudden change, but a quiet shift, where walking begins to feel less like something that must be managed step by step, and more like something that can continue with less conscious effort. And this shift reflects the reactivation of older patterns that were once maintained continuously. And although the modern environment does not always support the same level of uninterrupted movement, even partial continuity can begin to restore some of these effects, suggesting that the body does not require a complete return to past conditions to adjust its experience of walking, but does respond to smaller changes in repetition and stability, and this response highlights how adaptable the human system remains, because it is capable of shifting its internal balance based on what is done regularly, even within the constraints of modern life. And when this balance begins to shift, fatigue changes with it, becoming less abrupt, less dominant, and more evenly distributed across the duration of movement. And this does not remove the need for rest or eliminate the limits of the body, but it does alter how those limits are approached, allowing movement to extend further before reaching the point where stopping becomes necessary. And this is where the connection to Ice Age humans becomes clearer, because their lives maintain these patterns continuously, while modern life often interrupts them. And as a result, the difference in experience is not rooted in a missing ability, but in the stability of the pattern that supports that ability. And when stability is restored even partially, the experience of walking begins to move closer to what it once was, not identical, but less fragmented, less effortful, and less dominated by early fatigue. And this suggests that what has changed most is not the body itself, but the conditions under which the body is asked to operate. And when those conditions shift, even slightly, the body begins to respond, revealing that the capacity for sustained movement remains present, waiting to be expressed through repetition, continuity, and a gradual return to the rhythms it was shaped to sustain. When the body begins to reconnect with patterns of sustained movement, even in a limited way, a final shift becomes visible, and it is not only a change in how far one can walk, but a change in how walking fits into the experience of being alive, because movement starts to lose its sense of separation from the rest of the day and becomes more continuous, more integrated, and less defined as a task. And this matters because the closer walking returns to a background condition, the less it draws attention to itself as effort. And when attention moves away from the act of walking, the sensation of fatigue also becomes less central, not because it has disappeared, but because it is no longer the main reference point for experience. And this mirrors, in a smaller and more limited form, the conditions under which Ice Age humans lived, where movement was not something that had to be inserted into life, but something through which life unfolded. And when movement exists in that way, the body does not repeatedly question whether it should continue, and the mind does not constantly evaluate each signal of discomfort, allowing walking to proceed without becoming a continuous decision. And this reduction in decision-making lowers the mental component of fatigue, which can be as significant as the physical component over long durations. And this effect becomes more noticeable as repetition increases, because the body begins to trust its ability to continue, and this trust reduces the need for early caution, allowing effort to remain within a stable range without triggering strong signals to stop. And over time, this creates a more even and predictable experience of movement, where walking does not feel like a series of separate efforts, but like a continuous process that carries the body forward with less interruption. And this continuity does not need to match the scale of Ice Age life to produce meaningful changes, because even within modern environments, small increases in consistency can begin to restore parts of this pattern, showing that the underlying system remains responsive to how it is used. And this responsiveness highlights an important point, which is that the human body has not moved away from its original design as much as its daily context has moved away from the conditions that once supported that design. And when context changes, experience changes with it, making the same body feel different under different patterns of use. And this helps bring the question back to its original form, because the reason Ice Age humans did not get tired walking in the way modern humans often do is not that they existed outside the limits of the human body, but that they lived inside a pattern where those limits were approached slowly, steadily, and in alignment with continuous movement, and within that alignment, fatigue was present but less disruptive, less central, and less likely to interrupt the flow of life. And when modern patterns begin to move even slightly toward continuity again, the body reveals that this older relationship with movement has not disappeared, but remains possible, not as a return to the past, but as a reminder that the experience of effort is shaped as much by how life is structured as by what the body is capable of. And when structure changes, the meaning of fatigue changes with it, becoming quieter, more gradual, and less dominant within the simple act of walking. When all of these changes are placed together, the body, the environment, the rhythm of movement, and the way fatigue is interpreted, a quieter picture begins to form, one that does not rely on the idea that Ice Age humans were fundamentally stronger or more resistant to tiredness, but instead suggests that their experience of walking emerged from a long alignment between what the body was built to do and what daily life required it to do. And this alignment meant that movement was not constantly tested against comfort, not repeatedly interrupted, and not isolated as a separate task, but allowed to continue within a stable range where effort could be sustained without becoming overwhelming. And over time, this stability shaped not only physical capacity, but also expectation, perception, and behavior, creating a way of moving that did not need to overcome fatigue in dramatic ways, because it rarely approached fatigue as a sudden boundary. And when we look at the modern experience through this lens, the contrast becomes less about loss and more about distance, because the body has not lost its basic design, but has moved further away from the conditions that once kept that design active and visible. And this distance changes how walking feels, making it more noticeable, more segmented, and more easily associated with tiredness, even when the underlying capacity remains present. And this helps explain why the same human body can experience the same basic movement in two very different ways, depending on context, because context shapes not only what the body does, but how it interprets what it does. And when interpretation changes, the experience of fatigue changes with it, becoming either a quiet background sensation or a central feature of movement. And in Ice Age conditions, where movement was continuous and necessary, fatigue would have remained part of the background more often, rising gradually and managed within the flow of activity. While in modern life, where movement is often optional and separated from daily needs, fatigue becomes more visible and more likely to interrupt. And this difference suggests that the question is not whether humans have become weaker in a simple sense, but whether the patterns that once supported endurance have been replaced by patterns that emphasize stillness and interruption. And when those patterns shift, even slightly, the body begins to respond, showing that the experience of walking is not fixed, but shaped by repetition, expectation, and the structure of daily life. And this leads to a final understanding that is less about comparing past and present as better or worse, and more about recognizing how closely the feeling of tiredness is tied to the way life is organized around movement. And when movement is continuous, steady, and necessary, the body adapts to support it quietly. But when movement is separated, measured, and optional, the same body begins to experience it differently. And so the question of why Ice Age humans never got tired walking does not point to a lost ability that cannot return, but to a pattern that once existed and can still be partially approached, revealing that fatigue is not only a limit of the body, but a reflection of how that body is placed within the world and how often it is allowed to remain in motion without interruption. When this alignment between body, movement, and environment is no longer continuous, the experience of walking begins to feel like something that must be managed rather than something that simply happens. And this shift becomes clearer when we consider how modern life organizes effort, because effort is often separated into categories such as exercise, work, and rest. And once walking is placed into one of these categories, it is given a role that it did not always have, becoming something that is either performed intentionally or avoided when possible. And this intentionality changes how the body approaches it, since anything that is performed intentionally is more likely to be monitored, compared, and evaluated. And when evaluation increases, the perception of effort also increases, making fatigue more noticeable even when the physical demand remains moderate. And this is different from a context where walking is not assigned a specific role, but exists as a continuous condition that supports other activities. Because in that context, movement is not the focus, and without focus, the sensations associated with it remain less prominent, allowing the body to continue without drawing constant attention to itself. And this difference in attention has a measurable effect on how long movement can be sustained, since attention amplifies sensation, and amplified sensation influences behavior, often leading to earlier decisions to slow down or stop. And in Ice Age environments, where attention was directed outward toward the landscape, weather, and social group, walking was less likely to become the center of awareness, reducing the amplification of fatigue signals and allowing movement to continue as part of a larger process. And this outward orientation also reduced the need for constant internal comparison, since there was no fixed standard against which each step was measured. And without such comparison, the body could operate within a more flexible range, adjusting gradually rather than reacting sharply to small changes in sensation. And this flexibility is important because it prevents fatigue from becoming a decisive factor too early, allowing walking to extend beyond the point where it might otherwise be interrupted. And when we compare this to modern patterns, where walking is often measured in terms of distance, time, or performance, the contrast becomes clear, because measurement introduces a fixed reference point, and once a reference point exists, each moment of effort is evaluated against it, increasing awareness of strain and making fatigue more central to the experience. And over time, this pattern reinforces the idea that walking is something that produces tiredness, rather than something that can exist alongside it without interruption. And this reinforces the separation between movement and the rest of life, making it more difficult for the body to return to a state where walking feels natural and continuous. And yet, despite these differences, the underlying capacity remains, because the human body has not been fundamentally redesigned. And when movement is reintroduced in a more consistent and less segmented way, even within modern environments, the experience of walking begins to change again, becoming less abrupt, less evaluated, and less dominated by fatigue. And this gradual shift suggests that the difference between past and present is not fixed, but adjustable, shaped by how movement is integrated into daily life. And when that integration increases even slightly, the body begins to move closer to the conditions under which it was originally shaped, revealing that the feeling of tiredness while walking is not only a biological fact, but a reflection of how life is structured around movement and how often the body is allowed to remain within it. What remains, after looking across body, rhythm, muscle, landscape, habit, and time is a quieter conclusion than the title first seems to promise. Because Ice Age humans were not living beyond the limits of the human body, they were living inside the conditions that made those limits feel different, and that difference matters, because it suggests that fatigue is not only a sign of what the body cannot do, but also a reflection of how closely life matches the patterns the body was shaped to sustain. And for most of human history, those patterns were built around movement that was steady, necessary, and continuous, not movement inserted into life as a separate task. And when walking exists in that older way, the body does not need to overcome it each time. The mind does not need to question it each time, and the environment does not interrupt it each time. So the ordinary experience of tiredness changes, becoming slower, quieter, and less central. And this is why the answer to the title is not that Ice Age humans never felt fatigue in any literal sense, because they certainly knew cold, hunger, strain, and exhaustion, but that walking itself was less likely to become the thing that overwhelmed them, since walking belonged to the deep structure of life rather than standing apart from it. And once that is understood, the modern experience begins to look different as well, because the problem is not simply that the body became weaker over time, but that daily life moved away from the conditions that once kept movement natural. And when daily life moves away, the body adapts to that distance, making stillness feel normal and sustained movement, feel optional, noticeable, and effortful. And yet the deeper human design remains, still carrying the old ability to move steadily across time and ground when repetition, continuity, and expectation begin to support it again. And that is where the educational value of this question quietly rests, because it reminds us that many things we experience as fixed personal limits may also be shaped by the invisible structure of the world around us, by habit, by routine, by environment, by what the body repeats until it begins to believe that repetition is life itself. And this does not mean that modern people should imagine themselves as broken versions of the past, or that the past was somehow easier, because Ice Age life was harsh in ways that modern comfort has thankfully reduced. But it does mean that the feeling of being tired can reveal more than weakness. It can reveal mismatch, a gap between the ancient design of the body and the modern patterns placed upon it. And once that gap is seen, walking becomes more than a simple act or a simple inconvenience. It becomes a small window into human history, into the long stretch of time when movement was not a hobby, not a metric, not a performance, but the quiet road through which food was found, shelter was reached, groups stayed together, and life itself kept going. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson left behind by those distant walkers. Not that they were superhuman, but that humans are most at ease when action, expectation, and environment are not fighting one another. And when those things align, effort often becomes gentler than we assume, more patient than we assume, and less dramatic than the modern mind is used to believing. And so the title leads not to a myth about endless strength, but to a calmer truth, that the body changes its voice depending on the world it lives in, and that the tiredness we feel today may say as much about our way of life as it does about our muscles, our lungs, or our will. And if the human body still carries the memory of a world where walking was its oldest language, then when we feel tired now, are we hearing the true limit of the body, or are we hearing the sound of a life that no longer moves the way human life once did?